Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. What's up, guys? McJibbin here, back with another reaction video. All right, if you're not subscribed and want to learn about history through YouTube recommendations, just hang out. My name's Connor, and we'd love for you to join us. Hit that subscribe button. The more the merrier. History Matters, original link at the top of the description below. No one recommended this, but I wanted to check it out anyway, and let's do it.
1845 and North America looked like this. It was divided between the United States, the Republic of Mexico, the British Empire, and finally the Republic of Texas. In 1846, after a decade of indecision, the United States annexed Texas, which upset the Mexicans. This was because Texas had itself seceded from Mexico, and the two also claimed the same land, which now meant that the claims of Texas were the claims of the USA. President James K. Polk sent troops to the disputed Mexican-US border, and as he had hoped, fighting broke out, which meant war. Mexico surrendered after the US occupied its capital, Mexico City. In the subsequent 1848 peace treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexico ceded all of this territory. In the same year, the United States and Britain came to an agreement over the disputed northern territories and settled on this. So within only 4 years, the United States had grown from this to this, and it was spurred on by the idea of manifest destiny. This was the argument that the United States was willed by God and destined to spread westward and control all of this territory before making it fundamentally American. All of this new territory was not necessarily a good thing, though. So America at this point was economically, socially, and politically divided. North versus South, urban versus rural, slave state versus free state, and federal versus state government. The North was much more urbanized, industrialized, and for the most part had outlawed the practice of slavery. Many in the North saw it as a barbaric practice, a sentiment reinforced by its high rate of European migration, whom for the most part came from nations which had already outlawed its practice. The South was much more rural, with a greater focus on labour-intensive agriculture, which meant that slavery was economically valuable and had become a fact of life there. Those who held slaves there also believed that slavery was simply the natural order of things. The reason that the US had previously hesitated on the annexation of Texas was due to these internal tensions over slavery. In the US Senate, each state held the same number of senators, and within the Senate there was a balance between the states which allowed
So it's like whenever a state came in, there like had to be two states that came in at every time, like one pro-slavery or one where slavery was legal, one where it wasn't legal. So I think like they added Kansas, and so they added Maine, and then they added California, so they added something else, I forget, like that. So yeah, it's like they can never just add one state, because I'd be like, well, is it a slave state or a free state? And so it's like, all right, let's make two.
Slavery and those which had abolished it. Texas was a slave state, and so the balance was upset, which led to fierce debates over what should happen with the new territories and how they can be used to address this imbalance. There were many in the US who were fiercely opposed to slavery and thus didn't want any more slave states in the Union. One example was David Wilmot, who tabled the Wilmot Proviso, which was supposed to ban any territories acquired from Mexico from permitting slavery, but it got nowhere. On the opposite side, Senator Jefferson Davis of Mississippi argued that the new territories should be comprised of slave states and that furthermore, they should annex Cuba. Slightly more middle of the road was Stephen Douglas, who argued for what was called popular sovereignty, meaning that new states should be allowed to decide for themselves. These arguments culminated in the Compromise of 1850, which gave statehood to California as a free state, allowed the new territories in the South to decide whether or not they wanted to allow slavery, and importantly, it implemented a new and very controversial fugitive slave law. This required anyone in any state, even if it
So if I'm just trying to sound smart, I guess, because he's about to explain it. It's like if I know something, it's like, oh, I want to stop. I think this is the act that if a slave, shoot, now I might be wrong and look like an idiot, where if a slave like made it to the North, even though it's free, and even though the North sees African Americans as free people, free citizens, they still would have to return that slave back to the South, to whoever his or her owner was. And yeah, there was also there's some case where a slave went with his slave master up north, and then like while they were like with him, didn't escape up north or anything like that, but was with him, and then while being with him in the North, tried to say, hey, I'm in the North, I should be free. And there's another one about that. I don't know if it's Dred Scott. There's the 3/5
had abolished slavery
compromise.
to hand back escaped slaves to their masters. What this meant was that the North had to actively play a role in maintaining slavery, which was not something that they could abide. Also, as a side note, in 1853 the US purchased this land off of Mexico, thus completing its modern-day contiguous borders. Throughout the 1850s, anti-slavery sentiment called abolitionism grew throughout the North, with men like New York Governor and later Senator William Seward and the much more extreme John Brown being outspoken critics of slavery. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act opened up large-scale settlement and migration to those states whose position on slavery would be decided via popular sovereignty. Thus, proponents and opponents to slavery flooded into Kansas to aid their side in the debate. This resulted in what is known as Bleeding Kansas, whereby both sides there attacked and sometimes killed the other.
This is where John Brown comes in, right?
1856 saw the pro-slavery incumbent president James Buchanan of the Democratic Party run for re-election. He won, but this election is important because he ran against a brand new party, the Anti-Slavery Republic.
He's seen as generally one of the worst presidents of all time in American history, just because, I mean, it was, I guess, based mainly on the fact that there were clearly civil war on the horizon, tensions boiling between North and South, and he really didn't see it or just ignored it.
Party, which for the most part dominated in the North. The next year, 1857, saw a very important ruling by the Supreme Court in what's called the Dred Scott case. This was where Dred Scott, a slave, was taken by his master to Illinois, a free state. Scott argued that being in a free state meant that he was, by law, free. The court ruled no and further declared that black people were not intended to be US citizens at all, and by extension they had no rights worth protecting. Needless to say, this was a very
I mean, I guess they base that on the Fugitive Slave Act, where just as if they escaped to the North and they had to be returned, it would be the same with if they were with their master. I guess would have been their
controversial ruling. Further raised tensions between pro and anti-slavery that black people were not intended to be US citizens at all, and by extension they had no rights worth protecting. Needless to say, this was a very controversial ruling and further raised tensions between pro and anti-slavery factions. 1858 saw the Republicans attempt to challenge Stephen Douglas for his seat by putting some chap called Abraham Lincoln up against him. Douglas defeated Lincoln, but both had taken part in a series of debates which had made Lincoln well known across the country and cemented him as a leading abolitionist. Fortunately, after this, tensions between the North and the South, between pro and anti-slavery factions, died down. And by died down, I mean got considerably worse. The fierce abolitionist John Brown launched a raid on Harper's Ferry.
This guy is nuts.
This was supposed to seize weapons from the government
in a good
to
way,
give them
though.
to slaves to incite revolt. It didn't work. Brown was defeated, captured, and later hanged. Both North and South were now in a state of mutual hatred, and there was talk in the South of secession. In 1860, things got worse. The Republicans nominated Abraham Lincoln as their presidential candidate, and the Democratic Party was divided. In the South, they nominated current Vice President John Breckinridge, and in the North they chose Stephen Douglas. The vote was split, Lincoln won, and since Lincoln was an abolitionist, many in the South feared what he would do next. Lincoln was actually pretty moderate and pledged not to interfere with slavery in existing states.
Yeah, people don't really know that he has some really, I mean, nowadays would be considered extremely racist statements, but back in mid-1800s, 1860, whenever he was elected, were not very pro-abolition at all, but it later just built on him, and he ended up doing it.
But the damage was already done. Before Lincoln had even taken office, South Carolina feared what he would do, seceded from the United States. Within a couple of months, these states had joined them. This also included Texas, who had been in the Union for like 5 minutes at this point. These states then went on to form the Confederate States of America under the presidency of Jefferson Davis. During the early months of 1861, South Carolina had demanded that since they were...
1 second. Hello? Hey, I'm making a video right now, and Muscat. How many letters? No. Oman. I would say Oman, yes. Yep. Sorry about that.
were independent, federal troops should evacuate. In 1961, South Carolina had demanded that since they were independent, federal troops should evacuate. The federal government refused and maintained their garrison at Fort Sumter. On April 12, 1861, the Confederate States Navy bombarded the fort and captured it the next day, thereby beginning the American Civil War. By July, these states had also joined the Confederacy and thus were also at war with the United States. So before discussing the war itself, it's important to discuss how both sides saw the conflict. Both sides referred to the Declaration of Independence to justify their fight. The North, also called the Union, cited the all men are created equal bit, whereas the Confederacy focused on the right to alter or abolish unjust governments bit. The Union claimed that slavery held the entire nation back and prevented the South from industrializing and modernizing. They also argued that owning another human being was, wrong. The Confederacy claimed that the North was barely even American anymore with all those immigrants there, and so it wasn't for those who lived there to tell them what to do. They also argued that it was their right to form a better union, since as far as they were concerned, the current union did nothing to protect their enshrined rights to property, that property being slaves. So in terms of strengths and weaknesses, the union held massive advantages. It was more industrialised, had many more miles of railways and telegraph lines, and had a much larger economy. It also had a population of 22 million versus the South's 9 million, of which 3.5 million were slaves and thus not likely to fight. All of these things considered, it would seem inevitable that the Union would crush the Confederacy quickly, but when the two sides first clashed...
The Confederacy had the better general, or at least the best general, which was Robert E. Lee. He was asked by Lincoln, if I'm wrong with this, I'm wrong, but in the end, everyone knows that he chose to side with his state and be the top general of the Confederacy, but that he was asked by Lincoln to be the commander-in-chief or the top general in the Union Army, but he ended up siding with Virginia and therefore the Confederacy. But that's all they had going for them.
First Battle of Bull Run, the Confederates won. This was because they had many competent generals, the most notable, of course, being Robert E. Lee. The Confederacy, generally speaking, also had much higher morale because it's much easier to convince men to fight for their homeland than it is to get them to fight for concepts such as Union and abolitionism. The Confederacy also hoped to gain foreign support, to which it primarily turned to Britain. Britain was reliant on southern cotton imports, and when the Union blockaded the South, it meant that Britain's textile industry was severely disrupted. So in late 1861, when the Union captured Confederate delegates on their way to Britain in what is called the Trent Affair, the British were furious since it wasn't for the US to dictate who Britain could speak to. Britain postured, but after Lincoln released the diplomats, tensions cooled, and Britain then told said diplomats that they were on their own.
Do you guys think if Britain full on wasn't worrying about any wars in Europe, just put all of their forces in on the side of the Confederacy, do you think that they would have beaten the Union? I wonder. Let me know in the comments.
It was clear that the war would not be over quickly, and 1862 played host to two important battles. The first was the naval clash here at the Battle of Hampton Roads, which is important because it was the first clash of ironclad warships, the USS Monitor and the CSS Virginia. The Confederates had hoped to break the naval blockade, but failed. After this came the Battle of Antietam, which despite the Union having twice as many men, was a stalemate. But given that the Union didn't lose this battle, it gave Lincoln the opportunity to issue a warning that unless the Confederate States surrendered by the end of the year, he would abolish slavery. The Confederacy, of course, did not do that, and on the 1st of January 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which abolished slavery throughout the states of the Confederacy, but not in those still in the Union, which incidentally now included West Virginia, which had itself split from Virginia. Lincoln couldn't unilaterally abolish slavery everywhere, since he needed the permission of the states to do so. Since the South was in revolt, they didn't have any legislators whom the Union recognised, so Lincoln could do it on his own. The Emancipation did shift the framing of the war from one of maintaining the Union to one of ending slavery. This made Britain and France's offers of mediation look hypocritical, since they had already abolished slavery themselves. So 1863 also saw the war's most famous battle, the Battle of Gettysburg, which saw Lee attempt to bring the horrors of war to the North, but he was defeated and subsequently ran away. This battle was seen as a bit of a turning point, and when Lincoln won re-election the next year on a platform of "I'm going to crush them," it became clear that only total victory would do. The Union blockade was taking its toll on the Confederacy, and after the loss of Atlanta to General William Sherman, it became clear that the Confederacy was going to lose. And on April the 9th, 1865, at the Appomattox Courthouse, General Lee surrendered to Grant, effectively ending the Civil War. Jefferson Davis was soon after captured, the South was occupied, and the Union now had the difficult job of repairing the damage.
What did they do with Davis?
Lincoln was presumably very happy with this victory, but wouldn't have long to enjoy it. Lincoln took the time to go to the theatre, and a man called John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer, took the time to kill him. Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor as president, now had to create a peace that could heal a broken nation. 1865 saw the passage of the 13th Amendment,
Also not seen as a very good president.
which abolished slavery throughout.
Kind of for a similar reason as Buchanan, rather than, maybe even worse than Buchanan is, rather than failing to see the obvious tensions rising and a civil war almost imminent and not doing much about it or not caring, Andrew Johnson is kind of seen as almost reversing a lot of what the Civil War accomplished.
Throughout the United States. The primary cause of the Civil War was done away with, and so began the process of healing a nation, but of course, that would take a long, long time. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and thank you for watching.
Thank you for making.
Thanks to James Bisonet, Thomas...
Alrighty, guys. Awesome video as always. History matters. If you watch my channel for, anything more than a week, you probably know who they are, since I react to them all the time. I'll have another one coming out soon. See you guys next time. Hope you're doing well. See ya.